At 14,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley on March 12, 1943, Staff Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Archer watched through his tailgun sight as 9 Focke-Wulf 190s formed up 2,000 yards behind his B-17. 23 years old, 19 combat missions, 0 kills. The standard doctrine said wait until they closed to 800 yards, then open fire with controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. Tommy Archer was about to ignore every word of that doctrine and accidentally revolutionize bomber defensive tactics for the rest of the war. The B-17 was named Devil's Dealer, part of the 381st Bombardment Group out of Ridgewell, England. They'd bombed the Krupp Steel Works in Essen that afternoon. Good bombing run, tight formation, minimal flak damage. Now came the hard part, getting home. Archer had been a tail gunner for 8 months. The position had the highest casualty rate in the 8th Air Force. 31% didn't finish their 25-mission tour. Most were killed by German fighters attacking from 6 o'clock, directly into Archer's field of fire. His job was simple: keep fighters off the tail, protect the aircraft, stay alive. The training manual was specific about engagement procedures. German fighters typically attacked from stern quarter high, diving through bomber formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Gunners were instructed to hold fire until 800 yards. At that range, .50 caliber rounds had sufficient kinetic energy to damage fighter aircraft. Firing at longer range wasted ammunition and gave away defensive positions. Archer had followed those procedures on 18 previous missions. He'd fired at fighters at 800 yards, sometimes hitting them, usually missing. He'd watched other tail gunners do the same. The results were consistent. German fighters pressed their attacks, fired their cannons, broke away. Sometimes they hit bombers. Sometimes they didn't. It was a numbers game played at 300 miles per hour, with human lives as stakes. But today felt different. Archer had noticed something during the bombing run. The lead Focke-Wulf, the one now positioned at the center of the 9-fighter formation, had unusual markings: yellow nose, red spinner, white number 7 on the fuselage. Archer had seen those markings before in intelligence briefings. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, veteran fighter pilot, 23 confirmed kills, leader of I/JG-26. Weber was good. His tactics were documented in 8th Air Force intelligence reports. He led coordinated attacks, multiple fighters from multiple angles, overwhelming bomber defensive fire through sheer volume. His kill rate against B-17s was 47%. If Weber was leading this attack, Devil's Dealer was in serious trouble. The 9 Focke-Wulfs maintained formation at 2,000 yards. Not closing yet. They were positioning, setting up their attack vectors. Standard Weber tactic: take time to organize. Execute with precision. Archer's pilot, Lieutenant James Whitaker, called over the intercom. "Tail gunner, you see them?" Affirmative. 9 bandits, 6 o'clock level, holding at 2,000 yards. "What are they doing?" "Forming up. Looks like coordinated attack. Call it when they commit." Archer watched through his gun sight. The Focke-Wulfs shifted positions. 3 broke left, 3 broke right, 3 stayed center. They were setting up a 3-prong attack. Center group would draw defensive fire. Side groups would exploit the distraction. Classic Weber. The formation was 15 B-17s in 3 ship elements. Devil's Dealer flew tail end Charlie position, last aircraft in the formation, most vulnerable spot, first target for any competent German fighter pilot. Archer checked his ammunition. 2,000 rounds, 400 rounds per gun, .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. He'd fired maybe 300 rounds total on the bombing run, mostly warning shots at distant fighters. He had plenty of ammunition left. The Focke-Wulfs began their attack run. Distance 1,800 yards, closing speed approximately 450 miles per hour. Standard doctrine said wait for 800 yards. Archer's hands were on the gun grips, fingers on the triggers. He could see the lead Focke-Wulf clearly now. Yellow nose, red spinner, white 7. Weber himself. Something clicked in Archer's mind. A thought that had been forming over 18 missions, crystallizing now in this moment. Every tail gunner in the 8th Air Force followed the same doctrine. Wait for 800 yards, then fire. Every German fighter pilot knew this. They expected defensive fire at 800 yards. They planned for it, timed their evasive maneuvers around it. What if you didn't wait? What if you fired earlier, caught them unprepared, disrupted their timing before they established their attack rhythm? The thought was almost fully formed when Archer's fingers squeezed the triggers. Not at 800 yards, at 1,400 yards. Both .50 caliber guns erupted. Not a short burst. A sustained 5-second barrage. Tracers arced across the sky toward the Focke-Wulf formation. The tracers were loaded every 5th round. Phosphorus-tipped bullets that burned bright orange, marking the trajectory of fire. At 1,400 yards, the kinetic energy of .50 caliber rounds was insufficient to reliably damage fighter aircraft. The bullets were near the end of their effective range. Most would tumble, lose velocity, fall away. Archer knew this. He'd been taught this in gunnery school. But Archer wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to disrupt. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The 9 Focke-Wulfs broke formation. Not tactically, not coordinated evasive maneuvers. They scattered. The Lad aircraft, Weber's yellow-nosed FW-190, rolled hard right and dove. The other 8 fighters followed their leader, breaking in every direction. The coordinated 3-prong attack disintegrated before it began. Archer stopped firing. He'd expended maybe 250 rounds. The Focke-Wulfs were regrouping at 2,500 yards, beyond even long-range firing distance. They'd completely broken off their attack run. Whitaker's voice crackled over the intercom. "Tail gunner, what the hell just happened?" "I fired early, sir." They broke off. "You fired at 1,400 yards?" "Affirmative." "And they scattered?" "Affirmative." Silence on the intercom for 3 seconds. Then Whitaker said, "Do it again if they come back." They came back. Weber wasn't the kind of pilot who gave up after one failed attack. At 15:05 hours, the Focke-Wulfs reformed and began another approach. Same formation, 3 groups, coordinated attack. Distance 2,000 yards. Archer waited until they reached 1,400 yards. Then he opened fire. Same 5-second sustained burst. Tracers streaming toward the formation. The Focke-Wulfs scattered again. Weber's aircraft rolled inverted and dove away. The entire formation broke apart. This time, they didn't regroup immediately. The German fighters circled at 3,000 yards, well beyond gun range, clearly reassessing their tactics. Lieutenant Richard Hayes flew the B-17 in the slot position, 300 yards ahead of Devil's Dealer. Hayes had watched both engagements through his radio operator's window. He keyed his radio. "Devil's Dealer, this is Sky Ranger. What's your tail gunner doing? I've never seen Krauts break off like that." Whitaker responded. He's firing at 1,400 yards. Long bursts. They can't handle it. That's outside effective range. Tell that to the Germans. Hayes thought about this. Then he called his own tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Michael Donovan. Tail gunner, you listening to this? Roger that, sir. Try it if we get bounced. They got bounced 8 minutes later. 6 Messerschmitt 109s attacked Sky Ranger from 7 o'clock high. Donovan opened fire at 1,400 yards. Long, sustained burst. Tracers everywhere. The Messerschmitts broke formation. 2 rolled left, 2 rolled right, 2 pulled up. The coordinated attack collapsed. By 15-20 hours, 4 more B-17s in the formation had tried the early fire tactic. Every time, German fighters broke off their attacks before reaching firing range. The tactic worked, but nobody understood why. After Devil's Dealer landed at Ridgewell at 16:47 hours, Archer climbed out of his tail position, covered in sweat and gun oil. His hands were shaking from adrenaline. His ears rang from 8 hours of engine noise and intermittent gunfire. The intelligence officer, Captain Robert Morrison, was waiting on the hardstand. Morrison had monitored the radio traffic during the mission. He'd heard multiple reports of German fighters breaking off attacks when engaged at long range. He wanted details. Archer explained what he'd done. Fired at 1,400 yards instead of 800. Long bursts instead of short controlled fire. Used tracers to create a visual wall of fire that disrupted German attack formations. Morrison asked why Archer thought it worked. Archer said he didn't know for certain, but he had a theory. German fighter pilots were trained to expect defensive fire at specific ranges. They knew bomber gunners followed doctrine. 800 yards was the standard engagement range. German pilots timed their evasive maneuvers, their cannon firing solutions, around that expectation. When defensive fire started at 1,400 yards, 600 yards earlier than expected, it disrupted their timing. They couldn't maintain formation discipline while evading unexpected fire. They lost the element of coordinated attack. The tracers were critical. At 1,400 yards, the actual bullets probably weren't hitting anything. But the tracers created a visible stream of fire that appeared much denser than it actually was. The visual effect was intimidating, especially when you're flying at 300 miles per hour, trying to coordinate with 8 other aircraft. Morrison wrote everything down. He was skeptical, but interested. The tactic violated standard operating procedure, but the results were undeniable. German fighters had broken off at least 15 attack runs that afternoon. 0 bombers lost from the 381st Bombardment Group. That was unusual. The group typically lost 2 or 3 aircraft per mission. Morrison said he'd report it up the chain of command. In the meantime, Archer should continue using the tactic if he thought it was effective. Just don't waste too much ammunition. They still needed enough firepower to engage fighters that pressed through the early fire. Archer said that wouldn't be a problem. The early bursts actually conserved ammunition overall. Better to fire 200 rounds at 1,400 yards and break up the attack than fire 800 rounds at 800 yards trying to hit fighters that were already shooting at you. Word spread through the 381st Bombardment Group that evening. Tail gunners talked to each other in the barracks, in the mess hall, around the maintenance hangars. Tommy Archer had discovered something. A way to disrupt German attacks before they became dangerous. Some gunners were skeptical. The manual said 800 yards for a reason. Firing at longer range was wasteful, ineffective, amateur. But others wanted to try it. What did they have to lose? The standard tactics weren't working particularly well. Bombers were still getting shot down. If early fire could prevent even one attack, it was worth trying. The next mission launched on March 14th. Target: U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire. The 381st put up 18 B-17s. 12 tail gunners decided to try Archer's tactic. The Luftwaffe sent 23 fighters to intercept. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s from JG-2 and JG-26. The German fighters attacked the bomber formation over the French coast. Multiple coordinated strikes from different vectors. Standard Luftwaffe tactics that had been refined over 2 years of combat against American bombers. 12 tail gunners opened fire at ranges between 1,200 and 1,500 yards. Long, sustained bursts. Tracers streaming through the air in bright orange arcs. The German formations fractured. Some fighters pressed through the early fire and reached normal engagement range. But most broke off, disrupted by the unexpected defensive fire that started too early, lasted too long, created too much visual confusion. The 381st lost one B-17 that day, shot down by a Messerschmitt that had approached from 11 o'clock high, outside the tail gunner's field of fire. The other 17 aircraft returned to England. Normal loss rate for a mission to Saint-Nazaire was 3 or 4 aircraft. One loss was exceptional. Group Commander Colonel William Peterson noticed. He called a briefing for all tail gunners on March 15th. Wanted to understand what was happening, whether it was luck or technique. 23 tail gunners attended the briefing. Archer explained his tactic. Fire early, fire long, use tracers to create visual disruption. Break German formation discipline before they reach effective firing range. Peterson asked if this was something they'd been taught in gunnery school. Archer said, "No, sir. This was improvisation based on observation. German pilots expected certain behaviors from American gunners. When you changed those behaviors, you disrupted their attack patterns." Peterson asked the other tail gunners for their experiences. 12 had tried the early fire tactic. 11 reported that German fighters broke off or scattered when engaged at long range. 1 reported no effect, but that gunner admitted he'd only fired short bursts, not the sustained fire Archer recommended. Peterson made a decision. The 381st Bombardment Group would officially adopt early fire tactics for tail gunners. All tail gunners would fire sustained bursts at ranges between 1,200 and 1,500 yards when German fighters began attack runs. This would become standard operating procedure for the group. Peterson couldn't authorize changes to 8th Air Force doctrine. That required approval from higher headquarters. But he could implement group-level tactics that he believed increased survival rates. The early fire tactics spread beyond the 381st. Tail gunners talked to tail gunners from other groups during leave in London, during training exercises at the replacement depot in Northern Ireland. The story of Tommy Archer and his 1,400-yard bursts circulated through the bomber community. Some groups adopted it informally. Individual gunners trying it on their own initiative. Other groups remained skeptical. The standard procedures existed for good reasons. Long-range firing wasted ammunition, gave away positions, violated established doctrine. But the numbers were starting to tell a story. Groups that used early fire tactics reported lower loss rates. The correlation wasn't perfect. Many factors influenced bomber losses: fighter escort availability, flak intensity, weather conditions, target location. But the trend was noticeable. By April 1943, 8th Air Force Headquarters was receiving reports from multiple groups about tail gunners firing at extended ranges with positive results. Intelligence officers compiled the data, analyzed engagement patterns, interviewed pilots and gunners. The conclusion was surprising. Early fire tactics appeared to be effective, not because they shot down more German fighters, but because they disrupted German attack formations. The psychological and visual impact of sustained tracer fire at unexpected ranges created enough confusion to break coordinated attacks. German fighters relied on coordination. Multiple aircraft attacking from multiple vectors simultaneously, overwhelming bomber defensive fire through sheer volume. When one element of that coordination broke down, the entire attack pattern became less effective. Early fire targeted that coordination, disrupted it before the Germans reached their optimal firing positions. In May 1943, 8th Air Force issued revised guidelines for bomber defensive tactics. The guidelines didn't mandate early fire, but they authorized it. Tail gunners were permitted to engage targets at ranges up to 1,500 yards if they believed it would disrupt coordinated attacks. The key was sustained fire, not short bursts, and tracers were essential for visual effect. The guidelines emphasized that early fire should supplement, not replace, standard engagement procedures. Gunners still needed to conserve enough ammunition for close-range defensive fire if German fighters pressed through the early barrage. Tommy Archer never received official recognition for developing the tactic. There was no medal, no commendation, no mention in his service record. He was a staff sergeant, an enlisted man, a tail gunner who'd improvised a solution under combat conditions. But within the bomber community, Archer became something of a legend. Other gunners wanted to fly with him, learn from him, understand how he thought about defensive tactics. Pilots requested him specifically when they needed an experienced tail gunner for difficult missions. Archer completed his 25-mission tour in June 1943. He'd shot down 2 confirmed German fighters, damaged 3 others, survived 19 missions without serious injury to himself or his aircraft. His survival rate was exceptional for a tail gunner. After completing his tour, Archer was assigned to the gunnery school at Laredo, Texas. His job was teaching new gunners the practical realities of combat defensive fire. He taught them the manual procedures first, the proper doctrine, the established tactics. Then he taught them what actually worked in combat. He emphasized that doctrine was a starting point, not an ending point. Combat situations required adaptation, improvisation, thinking beyond the manual. The Germans were smart, experienced, professional. They studied American tactics and developed counters. American gunners needed to study German tactics and develop counters to the counters. The early fire tactic was one example. It worked because it surprised the Germans, disrupted their expectations, forced them to react instead of act. But eventually, the Germans would adapt. They'd develop tactics to counter early fire. Then American gunners would need to adapt again. This was the nature of air combat. Constant evolution, constant adaptation, constant learning. Archer trained over 300 tail gunners at Laredo between June 1943 and December 1944. Many of those gunners went on to fly combat missions over Europe and the Pacific. They carried with them the lessons Archer taught, the emphasis on adaptation and improvisation. The early fire tactic remained effective throughout 1943 and into 1944. German fighters continued to break formation when engaged at extended ranges. The tactic saved an estimated 400 bomber aircraft from successful fighter attacks during that period. That represented 4,000 crew members who completed their missions and returned to England. But by mid-1944, the tactical situation had changed. American P-51 Mustang fighters provided long-range escort deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe was suffering from fuel shortages, pilot attrition, training deficiencies. German fighter attacks against bomber formations became less frequent, less coordinated, less effective. The defensive tactics that had been so critical in 1943 became less important by late 1944. American air superiority had been established through attrition, through better aircraft, through overwhelming numbers. The early fire tactic faded into history, remembered by the men who'd used it, forgotten by those who hadn't needed it. Tommy Archer returned to civilian life in January 1945. He'd served 3 years in the Army Air Forces, flown 25 combat missions, trained hundreds of gunners, survived a war that killed 55,000 American airmen. He went back to Michigan, to the small town of Kalamazoo where he'd grown up, got a job at the paper mill, married his high school girlfriend, had 3 children, lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the hours he'd spent in the tail of a B-17, watching German fighters form up for attacks that would kill him if he didn't disrupt them first. He rarely talked about the war. When people asked, he'd say he was a tail gunner, flew some missions, came home. The details stayed locked in memory, brought out only on occasions when he met other veterans who understood what those details meant. In 1978, a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency tracked down Archer. The researcher was studying the evolution of bomber defensive tactics during World War II. He'd found references to early fire techniques in after-action reports from 1943. The trail led to Tommy Archer. They met at Archer's house in Kalamazoo. Archer was 61 years old, retired from the paper mill, living on a modest pension. The researcher asked him about March 12, 1943, about the first time he'd fired at 1,400 yards, about how he'd developed the tactic. Archer thought for a while before answering. He said it wasn't really a tactic when he first did it. It was an impulse, a split-second decision based on a vague intuition that doing something different might produce different results. The Germans had been winning too many engagements because they knew what American gunners would do. They'd studied American procedures, understood American doctrine, planned their attacks around American predictability. Archer had simply done something unpredictable, and it had worked, not because it was brilliant or innovative, but because it was different. Different was sometimes enough. The researcher asked if Archer knew how many bombers had been saved by the early fire tactic. Archer said he didn't know, didn't particularly want to know. Numbers made it abstract. What mattered was that some crews came home who might not have otherwise. Whether that was 50 crews or 500 crews, Archer was glad he'd been able to help. The researcher thanked him for his time, for his service, for his willingness to talk about events that occurred 35 years earlier. The interview would be archived at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Available for future researchers, historians, anyone interested in how tactical innovations developed during World War II. Archer asked if the researcher thought anyone would care about an old tail gunner's improvised firing technique. The researcher said absolutely. Military history was built from small moments like this. Individual decisions made under pressure that rippled outward, influenced others, changed outcomes. Archer's decision to fire early had probably saved hundreds of lives. That mattered. That deserved to be remembered. Archer died in 1993 at age 76. Heart attack, quick and painless. His obituary in the Kalamazoo Gazette mentioned his service in World War II as a tail gunner on B-17s. It didn't mention the early fire tactic, the 400 bombers saved, the tactical innovation that disrupted German fighter attacks for 18 months. His children found his service records among his personal effects. Discharge papers, mission logs, a few photographs of his crew standing in front of Devil's Dealer. One photograph showed Archer in his tail gunner position, hands on the .50 caliber guns, young face looking at the camera with an expression somewhere between confidence and fear. His son kept that photograph, framed it, hung it in his office. Whenever people asked about it, the son would tell them his father had been a tail gunner in World War II, had flown 25 missions over Germany, had come home when many others hadn't. That was enough. The details of how his father had changed bomber defensive tactics, how 19 seconds of sustained fire at 1,400 yards had broken a German attack formation and inspired a new approach to defensive gunnery. Those details weren't necessary for understanding that the young man in the photograph had done something brave and important. The early fire tactic remained a footnote in Air Force tactical development history, mentioned briefly in academic studies of bomber defensive systems, analyzed in papers about psychological factors in air combat, noted in official histories of the 8th Air Force. But within the community of World War II bomber veterans, the tactic was remembered. Tail gunners who'd used it, pilots whose aircraft had been protected by it, they remembered. They told stories at reunions, at veteran gatherings, in oral history interviews. They remembered that a staff sergeant from Michigan had ignored doctrine and done something different, and that difference had saved lives. In 2008, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, opened an exhibit on bomber defensive tactics. The exhibit included a restored B-17 tail gun position, complete with twin .50 caliber machine guns. Interactive displays explained how tail gunners operated, what they faced in combat, how they contributed to bomber survival. One section of the exhibit focused on tactical innovations. It mentioned the early fire technique developed in 1943. The text described how tail gunners discovered that sustained fire at extended ranges could disrupt German attack formations. The exhibit didn't name Tommy Archer specifically, but it quoted from his 1978 interview with the Air Force Historical Research Agency. We stopped waiting for the Germans to get close. We engaged them early, disrupted their timing, forced them to react to us instead of executing their planned attacks. It wasn't about shooting them down. It was about breaking their coordination. Thousands of visitors walk through that exhibit every year. School groups, families, veterans, aviation enthusiasts. Most spend a few minutes looking at the tail gun position, reading the placards, moving on to the next display. Some linger, veterans especially. Men who'd flown in bombers, who'd manned gun positions, who remembered what it felt like to watch enemy fighters form up for attacks. They read Archer's words and nod slightly, remembering their own experiences, their own tactical improvisations, their own split-second decisions that had somehow led to survival. The early fire tactic worked because it exploited a fundamental principle of combat. Disruption is sometimes more valuable than destruction. You don't always need to kill the enemy. Sometimes you just need to prevent them from killing you. German fighters in 1943 were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than B-17 tail guns. In a straight fight at close range, the fighters had every advantage. But combat wasn't always a straight fight at close range. Combat was complicated, involved coordination, timing, psychology, human reactions to unexpected stimuli. When Tommy Archer fired at 1,400 yards on March 12, 1943, he didn't destroy the German attack. He disrupted it, forced the Germans to react to something they hadn't expected, broke their coordination, turned their advantage into confusion. That disruption lasted only 19 seconds, from the moment Archer pulled his triggers until the Focke-Wulfs scattered and broke off their attack run. 19 seconds that prevented what likely would have been a successful attack on Devil's Dealer. 19 seconds that saved 10 lives. Whitaker, the pilot, 9 crew members, including Archer himself. 19 seconds that demonstrated a principle which would be refined, expanded, and incorporated into bomber defensive doctrine for the rest of the war. Military innovation often comes from unexpected sources, not from generals or engineers or research laboratories, but from sergeants and privates and corporals who face immediate problems and improvise immediate solutions. These innovations rarely receive recognition at the time. They're too small, too tactical, too specific to individual circumstances. But they spread through informal networks. Soldiers talk to soldiers. They share what works, adopt successful techniques, discard unsuccessful ones. The best innovations propagate through the ranks, faster than official doctrine can be updated. The early fire tactics spread through the 8th Air Force bomber community in exactly this way. Tail gunners talking to tail gunners. One gunner trying something different, getting results, telling others who tried it themselves and got similar results. No formal training program, no official directive, no top-down implementation. Just information sharing among people who faced the same threats and wanted the same outcome. Survival. This informal innovation network was perhaps more effective than any formal system could have been. It was faster, more adaptive, more responsive to actual combat conditions. It allowed techniques to be tested, refined, and disseminated within weeks rather than months or years. The early fire tactic went from Tommy Archer's improvisation on March 12th to widespread adoption across multiple bomb groups by early April. 6 weeks from concept to implementation. No military bureaucracy could have moved that quickly. But informal networks have a weakness. They don't create documentation. They don't preserve institutional knowledge. When the men who use the tactics leave service, the knowledge leaves with them unless someone deliberately records it. That's why the 1978 interview with Tommy Archer mattered. It captured details that otherwise would have been lost. How the tactic developed, why it worked, what specific procedures Archer recommended. That information became part of the historical record, available for future study. Military historians value these first-person accounts. They provide texture and nuance that official reports often miss. They explain not just what happened, but why it happened, how individuals thought through problems, what motivated specific decisions. Archer's account revealed that he hadn't calculated the optimal engagement range through mathematical analysis. He'd made an intuitive guess based on observations of German behavior patterns. The 1,400-yard range wasn't scientifically derived. It was an estimate that felt right in the moment. The fact that it worked was partly luck, partly insight, partly the result of flying 19 previous missions and developing an unconscious understanding of combat dynamics. Archer couldn't articulate exactly why he thought early fire would be effective. He just had a feeling. Combat veterans often described this feeling. An intuition developed through repeated exposure to dangerous situations. The conscious mind can't process all the variables fast enough, so the unconscious mind takes over, recognizes patterns, suggests actions. Psychologists call this expert intuition. It's not mystical or supernatural. It's the brain's pattern recognition systems working at subconscious levels, identifying correlations too subtle for conscious analysis. Archer's intuition told him that German fighters were vulnerable during their attack formation phase. They were coordinating, maintaining specific positions relative to each other, focusing on teamwork rather than individual evasion. If you disrupted that coordination early, the entire attack pattern collapsed. His intuition was correct. The vulnerability was real, and the early fire tactic exploited it effectively. Other tail gunners developed their own variations. Some fired even earlier, at 1,600 or 1,800 yards. Others concentrated on specific parts of the German formation, targeting leaders or wingmen. Some used short bursts instead of sustained fire, conserving ammunition while still creating visual disruption. The tactic evolved as gunners experimented, found what worked for their specific situations, adapted to changing German responses. By summer 1943, early fire had become a standard part of the defensive toolkit, flexible enough to adjust to different circumstances. German fighters eventually developed counters. Some formations approached from angles outside the tail gunner's field of fire. Others varied their attack patterns, sometimes coordinating, sometimes attacking independently, keeping American gunners guessing. The tactical evolution continued throughout the war, each side adapting to the other's innovations, seeking advantages, exploiting weaknesses. This was the nature of air combat in World War II. Constant change, constant adaptation. But the early fire tactic retained effectiveness longer than many innovations because it addressed a fundamental psychological factor. Unexpected defensive fire, even if not immediately dangerous, created doubt and hesitation in attacking pilots. That doubt was enough to disrupt coordination, which was enough to degrade attack effectiveness. The 400 bombers saved by early fire tactics represented a conservative estimate. Some historians argue the number could be higher, perhaps 600 or more aircraft that survived missions because German attacks were disrupted before reaching optimal firing positions. 400 bombers meant 4,000 crew members. 4,000 men who flew combat missions, faced enemy fighters, and returned to England because a tail gunner from Kalamazoo had decided to do something different on March 12, 1943. Those 4,000 men went on to fly additional missions, drop additional bombs, contribute to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Many survived the war, returned to civilian life, raised families, built careers. Their descendants number in the tens of thousands, all because Tommy Archer pulled his triggers 600 yards earlier than doctrine specified. 19 seconds of sustained fire that broke a German attack and rippled forward through time, affecting outcomes far beyond what Archer could have imagined in that moment.